This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with David McGarry, who serves as a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. They discuss conservative statism and the effects of Trump's America First economic policy, the corrosive effects of conservative statism on the American tradition, and how traditional conservatives can reclaim leadership on economic issues and economic theory.
David McGarry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, you are a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Full disclosure here, I was less aware of this entity and you until I had the opportunity to read a recent piece of yours in National Review, which really looked into a bunch of very interesting issues facing conservatives on economic policy and making a full-throated case why conservatives should embrace kind of the Hayek approach and to free markets. Give me just a quick overview of David, why you wrote that piece for National Review and what were you hoping to convey?
Well, I was reading Hayek in my free time, as one does, and I was reading his essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative. And one of his general points is that European continental-style conservatives have a tendency to not stand, they have a tendency not to stand for any affirmative set of principles, but merely to reactively oppose whatever they see as the forces of change. And I think that we're seeing this phenomenon happen actually in several different ways on the new right in America these days. And so essentially the case that I was making is that there is a new phylum of conservative that is pushing back on the natural and fully healthy and good development of markets. And a lot of this has to do with globalized trade, with globalized supply chains, with dispersed manufacturing. And the narratives that have sprung up, I think, ignore the actual economic data that show that American manufacturing and the American economy in toto is actually doing quite well. It is trending in the right directions, especially in instances where the government doesn't get involved and muck things up. And so the case that I was making essentially is that we should worry less about the specific structure or contours that markets shape themselves in, and we should worry more about allowing people to make the best uses of their productive abilities and their natural capacities to serve their fellow man and their fellow human beings. And really, as we look forward into the 20th century, do our best to unleash the productive power of markets rather than trying to micromanage them to whatever specific shape that we personally think might be attractive.
Okay, and so that's some big ideas, but obviously it's playing out in a big way in our politics and our policy and particularly within the Republican Party. You label this camp as the kind of statist conservatives, and here's a quote. Say, statist conservatives have eagerly imported European-style political and economic philosophies that acid-like erode the bedrock principles of the American founding. And I think by the American founding, David, you're really referring to these notions of liberty and kind of the ability to have own property and kind of the founding principles are articulated in our Declaration of Independence. And if you're a statist conservative, then you're somehow advocating policies that would undermine individual liberty and really go to the state to solve problems and address the needs of individuals and communities alike. Tell me if I got that right, and really where this resides, this quote-unquote statist conservative approach in the Republican Party today. Obviously, there's threads of it in President Trump and the Trump administration, as well as the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I think you formulated that well. American conservatism, simply put, is different from European conservatism. American conservatism conserves, if I can be slightly redundant, a classically liberal tradition that is enshrined in our founding, and that includes classically liberal free market economics. And if I can just take a quick digression, I'll note that the more state-friendly conservatives today who refer back to folks like Hamilton and as a justification for government intervention in markets really overstate the aggression of those historical figures' economic programs, and they try to draw inapt parallels. Like oftentimes they'll say, for example, that Hamilton's trade policies justify whatever draconian measures they're advocating today, and it's simply a category error. But to get back to your question, as Hayek writes in his essay, and as I try to tease out and explore, the European conservative sensibility places its faith in the state like a progressive might. The two express themselves in different ways, but the fundamental notion that change must be directed by the state, or perhaps the status quo must be protected by the state, depending on the situation, is common between the progressive and the statist-style conservative. Both want some power at the top of society, directing how culture and economies are shaped and what choices people make. And alternatively, the classical liberal, which in Europe oftentimes are still referred to simply as liberals, and the classical liberal in America, who today is referred to as a conservative, says that people have a right to make their own decisions, to direct their own lives, obviously within the context of the community and within certain reasonable bounds. But it's a fundamental difference between those who see the community or the group as the fundamental building block of society and those who see the individual as the fundamental building block in the fundamental unit of society and morality.
Yeah, and you characterize this group, this kind of a movement within the conservative movement, they're fueled by populist and anti-corporate fervor, and they, want to undermine or this kind of domestic markets and global supply chains, and to quote you say, return to a bygone era. You comment less prosperous industrial model, right? And that's what you're articulating, and this really is being expressed as a pro-worker. Kind of more emphasizing kind of production and outcome as opposed to allowing the market to determine, kind of what is the most efficient and best outcome. Really to see, what evaluating the economy based on its output, not kind of the input. Or this is getting a lot of play right now as you look at what President Trump has articulated in terms of tariffs. Not just tariffs on China, but actually an idea that he bandied about recently that we would do away with an income tax and actually replace the revenue that we get from income tax with tariffs. That would certainly depart from where conservatives have been. Certainly, Hayek conservatives and conservatives that came in through the 20th century, most notably through the Reagan administration. Be a huge shift. So talk about, if you might, where you see these policies being articulated and advocated for. I reference what President Trump has spoken about, but it's obviously playing out in the Congress as well.
Yeah, I quickly want to quibble with just one part of the question, if I may. I don't think that the putatively pro-worker policies advanced by the new right are geared towards maximizing production, because maximal production oftentimes will mean fewer workers using more highly developed technologies and more efficient technologies to raise output, especially in the manufacturing context. So we've actually seen in the past several years, as manufacturing employment has ticked up, manufacturing output has stagnated. These two trend lines are not going to go in lockstep. With respect to where we're seeing these energies, it is something, unfortunately, that has become popular on both sides of the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats today, as a general rule, have developed a taste for tariffs. They've developed a taste for industrial policy, and exactly what types of economies they're trying to create with their government interventions are different. The Democrats want something that's much more geared towards net zero and supposedly environmentally friendly outcomes, whereas Trump, the way he talks about these things, conjures up images of the 50s or the 60s and this supposedly golden age of American manufacturing. but at the core of it, there is the fallacy that the government can direct market resources more efficiently, and the government can overcome the knowledge problem, and the government can somehow surpass the efficacy of price signals in order to create prosperity. And that is something that people have been arguing for millennia. These ideas go back to the I would argue to the ancients, and they weren't right then and they're not right now. And certainly as supply chains globalize and as economies become much more complex and textured, I think that the knowledge problem is only more applicable today. And we are going to find that out at our peril. And we have had the benefits of watching other countries impose more and more regulations. I'm thinking of Europe specifically, and just as a region. And they have provided some very strong data that suggests that central planning still does not work, even with the wonders of modern technology.
Yeah, we're here with David McGarry from the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Wrote a very interesting piece in National Review recently on Hayek and statist conservatives and where the Republican Party is and should be going forward. President Reagan famously quipped that the most terrifying words you can hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And it seems to me the primary critique, or one of the primary concerns with who you characterize as the statist conservatives, is that they really do look to the state to solve these problems. And it ultimately is not a proven success story, as you just pointed out, David, nor is it kind of run inconsistent, I would think, with our founding principles. But it didn't come out of nowhere, David, right? And certainly, whether it's the Marco Rubios of the world or the J.D. Vances of the world, they're looking at whether or not the free trade policies that characterized the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century really benefited the American worker, the middle class, the lower middle class, and that seems to be the core of the debate. Whereas their critique of corporate America is one that they were the ones who benefited from those policies, this quote unquote unfettered free market. But in the end of the day, the American worker was the one who was left out. And that, of course, as our viewers and listeners know well, is a primary explanation for the frustration amongst the electorate that led to President Trump being elected in 2016 and perhaps being reelected in 2024. So I'd love to get your take. Your piece dealt with this a little bit, but not directly, as I recall, in terms of the American electorate and the American worker, and to what extent the free market policies that governed Republican thinking from the Reagan era through, as I mentioned, early part of the 21st century, kind of didn't benefit all Americans, and certainly the American worker.
Sure, I would say that the Rubios and the Vances make two fundamental errors. And first off, they try to insinuate that the economic outcomes that we have in modern America are the product of libertarian orthodoxy. It's a slur that they throw around, and the fact is, it's just not true. Ever since, we can go back to FDR and the New Deal, or perhaps even further. The federal government and state governments have interfered extensively in markets, and many of the negative outcomes, and especially the pro-corporate negative outcomes that we see in American economics, I would argue are the effect of bad regulation and regulatory capture that create distorted incentives and let bad actors off the hook, and even to a large extent discourage insurgent competition that might break up problematic incumbent market shares. So that's critique number one. Critique number two is that many of the claims that are made about the destructiveness of globalization, which is another supposed, or it's another word that's used as a slur. Many of these critiques are simply not based in the academic literature. The famous China shock that supposedly resulted from China's ascension to the WTO was neither the research shows that it was neither as severe as many people make it out to be. It was actually a fairly moderate it caused fairly moderate impact on the American economy. And second of all, it was also largely caused by other factors like China's domestic policy and their own liberalizations, rather than America's more friendly posture towards China. And another thing that I'll say on the topic of globalization is that when America outsources certain things to other countries, or when America uses more efficient technologies here, what we are doing is we are freeing human capital, domestic human capital, to go to its best and most productive uses. And while there are many towns, especially in the old Rust Belt area, that have famously become hollowed out as their manufacturing has left, there are many other towns that have pivoted and have been able to adjust to modern economic developments. And it's not a lock that progressions in economics are going to lead to some kind of societal fraying. Obviously, when a major business leaves a town, that is going to create instability, that is going to be a shock. But there are many other factors that play into the sort of the poster child cultural deterioration that folks like Rubio and Vance harp on.
So I want to get to manufacturing, make an interesting point that the state of U.S. manufacturing is not as bad as some of these critics argue. And also we need to talk about China too. You've mentioned China a couple of times. But before we go there, one of the critiques is that the result of letting the market drive the economy in any direction it goes actually has been distorted, and you get the world of finance is oftentimes the case in point, where it's really not producing anything broadly from the economy other than kind of hedge funds kind of just making bets and getting wealthy, but it's not in any way resulting in jobs or prosperity, kind of distributed, or production of anything particularly valuable. Oren Cass and others make this critique. What's your view on that? That in a sense the market has actually perhaps produced outcomes where manufacturing is overseas. I heard your critique of that. We'll get to that in a second. And also, it kind of creates these sectors that are actually not particularly productive, certainly to the extent that it reaches the American worker or most of American society.
Sure. So the big picture critique that I have of many such arguments is that the income inequality and the relative trajectory of working class people's incomes and wealthy people's incomes is highly exaggerated. And there's been a lot of work that shows that once you actually calculate the numbers properly, and you factor in taxation, and you factor in government programs, there's a much smaller gap between the haves and the quote unquote have-nots than is oftentimes stated. Also, I would say that if you look at America's overall wealth, our GDP per capita is very, very, very good. We pretty much lead the world, with the exception of certain countries with very special circumstances like petrostates and that kind of thing. Also, in terms of what we make and what we don't make, we're the number 2 manufacturer in the world. We are by far first in per worker productivity in manufacturing, and it's not even close. And even our manufacturing raw output numbers understate the importance of what we're producing. We are highly leveraged towards cutting edge technologies, towards high value products. We, even outside of what is technically classified as manufacturing, we are highly invested in research and development, where we may develop something here in the States and then send it for manufacturing somewhere else where it is more cost effective. And that doesn't even get counted into our numbers. But still, if you're asking yourself what is quote unquote productive, what is important to a developing economy, or a developed economy, and to an economy that needs to continue to be at the forefront of technology, I would argue that America is in a very good place overall. In terms of employment, we currently have very low unemployment numbers, and while we do have a lot of problems with people exiting the workforce, with people with working age men particularly choosing to be jobless, I would argue that is more a function of the welfare state than it is a function of America's economy not offering opportunity.
Yeah, that is interesting argument, one that certainly, kind of free market conservatives make all the time. You have historically low levels of unemployment. The global manufacturing output, we're second, as you point out. And what it has done, though, as we've modernized 21st century production and manufacturing, is that the products that were no longer made in the United States, there were workers left on the side, and that goes, David, to the point you made before. Either they haven't been able to reintegrate into the economy, finding other opportunities in manufacturing or elsewhere, and primarily because the things they were doing beforehand are either not made in the United States or made with different technology. Let me ask you about China here, David, because the argument that I think is most persuasive for the use of industrial policy tools, most famously, I think you'd look at the CHIPS Act that the Congress passed and President Biden signed into office, is one where you're trying to level the playing field in sectors, particularly sectors that are critical to U.S. national security, semiconductors being the most famous and perhaps most relevant example, where in the absence of having some industrial policy, you wouldn't have a level playing field with China, since it's all subsidized or significantly subsidized by the PRC. What accommodation, kind of in your outlook, do you make for China and the U.S. responding with some industrial policy to level that playing field?
That is a wonderful challenge, and free marketeers since Adam Smith have recognized that national security concerns sometimes simply must trump economics or strictly economic factors. However, when we are looking at some sort of ill that we are trying to remedy or address, we have to make sure that the policy solution will actually accomplish its goal. And to take the CHIPS Act, we've seen tens of billions of dollars allocated to subsidize an industry that, for myriad economic factors, will not take hold in the United States. A perfect example of the failure of the CHIPS Act is the fact that the TSMC, Taiwan's premier chip manufacturer, is going to build factories here, but they're going to continue to produce their most cutting-edge chips in Taiwan. They're not actually bringing the very chips which the legislation was intended to foster domestically into this country. The act, for all of its good intentions, simply will not fulfill it will not achieve the goals of the act supporters. And so this leaves libertarians, or I should say libertarian tending people who like free markets, in an odd place, because sometimes we're accused of wanting to do nothing. And the issue that I would take with that is that if your only options are to do nothing or to make matters worse, doing nothing is probably the prudent choice. And that's not an easy sell. That's not
definitely not one that's going to get you elected, or actually, it's hard to see how it's going to solve problems, particularly as it relates to chips. And I guess I'm less persuaded by the argument that even getting some of TSMC's, that's the manufacturer in Taiwan that makes the highest end chips, they have the fabs. Even if we don't have their top tier, but having something else at least gives us some industrial capacity. One of the arguments that Oren Cass from American Compass, and certainly the target of one of the targets of your critique, David, makes that I think is persuasive, or something worth looking at, is that he makes an argument made this years ago, is that as manufacturing goes overseas, so does the kind of R&D eventually follow it. And so he sees some correlation between manufacturing in the United States, or wherever it is, oftentimes is what drives the R&D. And you may not agree with that, but it would answer this critique. Even if we're not making the highest end chips in the United States, but if we're starting to have fabrication of chips that will be utilized, it could lead eventually to some sort of renaissance where the higher end manufacturing, the highest end manufacturing, could be in the United States. From a national security standpoint, I think it's probably a bet worth making rather than, David, as what you're saying a moment ago, not doing anything. But I think in the China realm, certainly is an area where I think there are strong arguments to think about some form of industrial policy. Certainly, we do that in the world of national defense, which would be the class case where you have a monopsony, where that is clearly the place for the government to spend and to drive, given that constitutionally is uniquely the role of the United States. Let me move on, just David, as we close out our conversation, to get your take on kind of where we go from here. If we do have a second Trump administration, second term, you have the emphasis on tariffs. Tariffs as they relate to China seems to be something that we can fully expect. How do you see it playing out? And where do you anticipate the big debates playing on a policy level in a Trump administration?
It's almost certainly going to go poorly for American consumers and American manufacturers. The Trump administration's, or the first Trump administration's, tariffs lowered GDP, they lowered employment. For every job that they saved in protected industries, they cost many more in downstream industries. And contrary to whatever the Trump team said, the economic research conclusively shows that the price of tariffs was not borne by the Chinese. It was borne by the American companies and the American consumers who had to buy the tariff goods. And we, even from those tariffs, saw knock-on effects where newly disadvantaged companies started asking for their own rafts of protectionism. And so you kind of have tariffs all the way down. And it is a bleak outlook for those of us who do believe in free trade. The Republican Party has taken a turn, and has taken a pretty aggressive turn. And even if Trump does not fully go to his worst instincts, a 10% blanket tariff on all imports, Americans are still going to see higher prices and degraded manufacturing capacity and lower employment, and that is not something that conservatives or anyone who really cares about the strength and robustness of America's economy should be comfortable with.
So I think where a lot of conservatives go, those who are big free trade advocates, and then are trying to accommodate some of the Trump era policies, they've modified their language from just free trade advocates to free and fair trade. And certainly, I think it's common sense that the fair piece is one where China doesn't play fair, and therefore some sort of action to make sure that from a trade standpoint we're not being exploited for approaching trade with China, assuming that they're entering, they're playing, kind of to the free market in the same way the United States is. Clearly, they have not. And so I guess the outlook that seems to be a hybrid approach is, hey, free and fair trade. We should embrace free trade agreements. I mean, the Trump administration, for example, updated NAFTA to make, for the USMC, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement. Hasn't been much on free trade since, but perhaps there is an opportunity to advance bilateral trade with other free market countries, and at the same time, in parallel, with a country like China, make sure that they're not exploiting our free market system. Give me a reaction to that, David.
Sure. Fair trade is unquestionably a good. However, again, I think the policy question comes down to what are the actual consequences of tariffs or of some other kind of protectionism or industrial policy, not just what are their intentions. And the Trump administration largely failed to remedy the the Chinese misconduct, or to reverse the Chinese misconduct that it was attempting to combat. And one other thing I'll say, and this is something that Trump started, but Biden has been just as guilty of. The American policy today is to obstruct the workings of the appellate body at the World Trade Organization. So essentially, what this means in practice is that the WTO cannot actually successfully adjudicate any cases that are brought because of unfair trade practices. And now we have an interest in doing that because we are violating our own WTO commitments. But what this also means is that we cannot go after China for a lot of their misconduct. And despite sort of public perception, China actually through the years has been more or less responsive to WTO rulings. They kind of realize that they have to play within a somewhat of the system that we have set up. But because today we have so much U.S. obstructionism, that is preventing us from using that forum to achieve fair trade. And instead we're reverting to ineffective and self-destructive tariffs. And I don't think that's a switch that we want to continue going forward, even though, as you said, it has a certain sort of political resonance. It in practice doesn't work out very well.
Before we go to our lightning round, David, just wanted to ask you, who do you see right now in the conservative movement, elected official, Republican Party, that is the clearest proponent of the free market, free trade, Reaganite approach to the economy?
Oh, that's a good question. I will start by saying this is an unconsidered answer, but I will shout out Senator Rand Paul. He's generally very good on market economics. He tends to understand these things. He understands a lot about regulatory capture and the importance of getting the federal government out of the American people's business.
All right, let's go to our lightning round. We're with David McGarry of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. This is where we ask all our guests to provide their favorite Reagan speech, quote, and book. We'll take all three, two, or if you only have one, what do you have for us?
I'll go. I'll do the rounds. I'll take all three.
Okay, shoot.
All right. So for the speech, I will go very normie, and I will say the tear down this wall speech. I think that in those couple sentences, President Reagan made a brilliant and rhetorically inspiring defense of freedom. It was a stand against tyranny, stand against perhaps the worst tyranny that the world has ever seen, or something close to it. And there's something about that is immortal and will live through the ages.
That's an oldie but a goodie. We like that one. All right, that's the speech.
In terms of book, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the beaten path now. I'm going to say Matthew Continenti's The Right, which is a 100-year history of American conservatism. And in many ways, what that book is the story of how the right crescendo to Reagan, and then how the right processed what had happened during the Reagan Revolution, and how the right has attempted to find its way after the Reagan Revolution. And I think that it's a historical perspective that puts Reagan in context, but also really says a lot about the Republican Party and the American conservative movement, and also just American culture and politics generally.
That's a great one. He has a nice picture of Reagan on the cover of that book, but as I told Matt, it wasn't quite big enough. So he's got some work to do. All right. And last, what do you got?
For quote, I will choose the punchline to one of President Reagan's joke, which is, "This is the first time that I've ever given a Republican speech from the Democratic platform."
All right. David McGarry, thank you for being on the show. Great conversation. And we'll certainly continue focusing on this subject.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.